Today we're going to explore the sort of overarching ideas of the textual conversations module. We're going to be looking at the poetry of Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes, and look at the discourse, the conversations that are occurring between those two texts and with other texts as well. This is part of the Module A part of the course. I'm going to begin with a contradictions disclaimer, because I want to say to you that we're not interested in the personal politics between the two poets. More, we're looking at the conversation between the ideas, but you will find that I will slip into their personal narrative. It's pretty hard to avoid, but you want to try and separate the ideas of the poetry and not get involved in the blame game of who was right and who was wrong. So we want to think about poetry as being a form of catharsis, okay? And so it's a way of expressing oneself and providing a sense of release, and looking at poetry as a fictional endeavour as well. So it is very clear that the poetry of the two poets has relevance to their personal lives. And what we want to do is we want to try and look at larger ideas to do with concerns of the situation of people in the world in which they were writing. So one thing that we want to look at is the narrative that is established, okay, and who has control of the narrative. You know, so we're talking about the idea of the concept of authority, and if we think about the gendered narrative in our world, we can suggest it this way, that men are presented as powerful and controlling, and that women are victims and helpless and meant to be passive, you know, and this obviously is a byproduct of the patriarchal society. Sylvia Plath was writing in the 1960s, a very conservative patriarchal sort of world, and then Ted Hughes publishes birthday letters in the late 90s, 1998, in a postmodern era. And, you know, obviously the patriarchal society and the power relations between men and women still existed. So we can explore the poetry through that gendered lens, and it's going to lead to an interesting exploration of the narrative that's constructed. Okay, who constructs the narrative? What's their agenda? And who plays roles in those particular in that particular narrative? On a personal level, and we go back to this contradictions disclaimer, the narrative that is set up between the two poets, but also in their poetry as well. And initially it's a reaction to Sylvia Plath's publication of Ariel in 1965, I think it is, where the interpretation of her poetry is that Ted Hughes was the alpha male and the destroyer of women, and that Sylvia Plath, she was beautiful, she was innocent, and a victim of male power. And there is certainly truth to that, and you can go looking for aspects of their personal life, and certainly there have been many pieces written about this narrative. But we have to ask ourselves, is that really what the poetry is about? Was it Sylvia Plath's intention to say, my husband who's left me, who's had an affair and was separated, you know, he's not a good guy? Is she telling the whole world about her dislike for Ted Hughes, or has she got a larger agenda? And that's really what we have to look at. Okay, so is it about personal politics, or is it about gender politics? Okay, let's move over here. So when we look at Sylvia Plath's poetry, she has created personas within her poems, and we want to try and consider that it's not her. And a great one I like to start with is Lady Lazarus, because that's not Sylvia Plath. It's an invented character in response to it's an allusion to Lazarus in the biblical stories, and certainly it's not her, and she creates this alpha female who eats men like air. She's full of power, and full of I suppose anger and power as well, and she uses that as a platform to express her frustrations with the treatment of women in society. And if we can look at all of her poems in that manner, then that will lead to some really interesting ideas about things like the conflict between the expected identity of women in society. So on one level, and on one hand, I suppose women are meant to be beautiful, desirable, alluring. Okay, but they're also meant to be passive, domestic, and maternal, and there is a real conflict between that. And there's a lot of hypocrisy involved in the expected roles of women compared to the expected roles of men. And so her poetry really harnesses that frustration, and is a means by which she is expressing the frustrations of all women before her, and that the feminist movement had stalled and has stalled numerous times prior to her writing her poetry, and she explains it as a fixed foot, like a stagnant foot on the ground. There is no movement forward, and so that's a really interesting idea to explore. She's also critical of the objectification of women, and that comes through in a lot of her poems, and that she also talks about the need for women to wear masks, and she uses veils a lot of the time. That the true identity is hidden behind a veil, behind the veneer of the perfect beauty, that type of thing, and that women are subject to performative identity, that they must perform different roles in different aspects of society, so there's some interesting ideas that are going to explore identity and power relations and things like that. Okay. The other thing that's quite important about Sylvia Plath's poetry is that she writes through confessional poetry. Okay, so it's very intimate, it's very personal. It's she's publishing to the world her inner thoughts, her innermost concerns and fears and thoughts and that type of thing, and it's extremely confronting, particularly in conservative 1960s society. She's talking a lot about taboo topics, which is really threatening the status quo, and you get the impression that it's the type of thing that male power does not want to explore or discuss, and so it's quite confrontational, but it's very powerful in what it does, because some of it is incredibly shocking, and that she's deliberate in her confrontation because she wants to really sort of rattle the cage. She wants people to stop and take notice, and certainly the world did that. Okay, now we want to look at the literary communities and just the general public's response to her poetry, because that's really important in our study, because it's very scathing of Hughes, and that it sets up the narrative, as I said before, that Hughes is the alpha male. He's the destroyer of not only Sylvia Plath but subsequent women as well, and that Plath was a victim victim in this situation. And, you know, we can look at even to the point where for many years after, Sylvia Plath's gravestone was vandalised because her gravestone said Sylvia Plath Hughes, and people would chisel Hughes's name off the gravestone. Okay, and so it comes back to that idea of who controls the narrative, and certainly the powerful institutions have taken control of that narrative, and then we have 30 years later, Ted Hughes publishes birthday letters in response to Plath's poetry. And of course, some parts of it is a justification or him downplaying his responsibility. But more so, he is casting doubt on the interpretation of Sylvia Plath's poetry. So the conversation that he engages in is not with Sylvia Plath, but with the critics, and essentially that's who Sylvia Plath is speaking to as well. And they're, Plath and Hughes both align in their dislike or their criticism of the critics. Okay, we talk in the rubric about resonances and dissonances. So there are some things that resonate. There are some ideas, aspects of their poetry that are similar. So resonances and dissonances, similarities and differences, resonances and dissonances. And so here is one area where they certainly do agree, and that they both have the same attitude towards those who control the narrative. Okay, and so Hughes calls his publication Birthday Letters, which was actually what Sylvia Plath was going to call her collection of poetry. She changed her mind and called it Ariel instead, because there was the poem within the collection about a horse that was free. It was all about freedom. Hughes calls his collection Birthday Letters to explore that idea that there are different perspectives, and that the truth, there are, you know, differing levels of truth and different variations of truth and that type of thing. And from my perspective, what I think Ted Hughes is attempting to do by publishing this work is to liberate, to free Sylvia Plath's poetry from the control of the powerful. He wants to liberate it so that it can be appreciated and understood in a different manner. And in doing that, I think he is liberating her poetry from being stuck in a 1960s mindset, you know, it's reflective of that era, and making it more universal. And there is this rich conversation between the two. Okay. Ted Hughes totally changes his writing style when he publishes these poems, and obviously he has worked on these poems for 30 years and kept them to himself. He didn't engage in any public debate about the poetry, or he never responded to the accusations that were made against him. And just before he died, he published these poems, and that was his means of setting a different agenda about reframing the discourse. So the other thing in the rubric that's important is the idea of reshaping and reframing. So what Ted Hughes does is he adopts Sylvia Plath's confessional style, so he reshapes the aspects of her poetry. Okay, so he uses her style, and he responds to poems that she's written. He imitates the poem, providing a different perspective. So he's reshaping her poetry, but what he's also doing is he's reframing the discourse. So he's trying to reframe that narrative to move it away from the victim-villain binary to being more concerned about truth and perspective and hindsight and things like that. I've forgotten there was one other thing I was going to say about that, but it'll come back to me later. I think I was going to say that Hughes adopts Plath's confessional style. He'd never written in that manner before, and it is a very skillful body of work. And Plath's poetry is unbelievably incredible, and so his imitation is a great form of flattery, but it has certainly a purpose to it. One thing that we can talk about too, just before we move on from that personal narrative and everything, is that when Sylvia Plath dies, Ted Hughes became the executor of her work, and so he, from memory, actually reordered the poems, and I think he might have removed some and added some poems. So he did do that. He also destroyed some of Plath's personal diaries, memoir type things, and so this caused a lot of criticism as well. And there are different ways we can look at that, whether he was doing it because he was an oppressor or because he was defending Sylvia Plath. And that'll be up to you to go and do some reading and come to an understanding, but not to get too involved in that the politics of the personalities. Let the poetry do the talking and explore the bigger ideas. Okay, so rather than looking at this is a conversation between Sylvia and Ted, it's a conversation between the genders. Okay, and looking at the representation of women and the representation of men, and the things that resonate and the things that are different as well in that regard, because there are a number of poems where obviously Hughes he reshapes Plath's poetry and suggests that she's not a passive victim, that she's powerful, but also there are poems where their ideas do align, and Plath is saying women are subject to having to wear masks and that they're victims of the patriarchy, and Hughes agrees with that, but he says that men are as well. So he's expanding that notion that Plath has presented. So now we might just look at the ideas that each of the poets present, and then we'll look at how they're a reflection of the context. I should say too that we should study these poems as one complete text. So rather than thinking of them as individual texts, they are a suite of poems that create one main text. That's a thing to keep in mind anyway. So we were talking about Sylvia Plath's poems in the collected works of Ariel as being concerned with identity, the gender roles, the double standards, and the expectations of men and women. We think about men who have an affair or have multiple relationships is seen as in positive terms, whereas it's very detrimental to a female's identity. So the double standards and the hypocrisy of it were very apparent. She explores this notion of isolation in a number of ways. One of them being, in the poem Nick and the Candlestick, that after giving birth to her son, or she's expressing the feeling of mothers once they've given birth to a child, the isolating nature of that. When women were married in the 60s in Australia, and obviously in England as well, they were expected to quit their job. They had to resign. There was no question about it. That was the rule. And so it was a very isolating experience in that sense. A feeling of powerlessness. she explores the duality of identity, and we talked about that before, the conflict between needing to be beautiful but also motherly, and the performativity and objectification and the scathing criticism of that things associated with that. So this is all born out of her reaction to what was going on in her world. So her poetry is part of the end of the modernist era, which was a reaction to World War I and World War II and the events and society and all the things that were going on at the time. So certainly her poetry is a reaction to World War II. She references the Nazis as, and the Nazis as agents of evil, and also the Holocaust references. At the time, the Cold War was creating a lot of anxiety due to the fear of the nuclear war. Also, she's responding to the conservative 1960s patriarchal values, the stalling of the feminist movement. So there is an expression of frustration there. Mental health is very prominent in her poetry, and in the 60s they were treating patients with electroshock therapy. There was also the emergence of the pill, the contraceptive pill, which really conflicted with the expectations of purity and virginity before marriage and things like that. And so there's a lot. It's a very rich time in which to explore these ideas. Plath is writing in the middle of her experience, and and that leads to some very powerful poetry. Hughes, on the other hand, publishes his work 30 years later, and obviously he's writing his poems throughout the span of those 30 years, which provides a bit of distance from the events and the opportunity for reflection and a bit of hindsight, perhaps. And that can be a positive, but it can also change one's perception or memory of the events prior. So it's complicated. He is concerned with truth, but he's looking at the ambiguity of truth, and I've written down here the malleability of truth, and that some of his poetry casts doubt on the truths that have been constructed through the peanut crunching crowd, the critics of Ted Hughes. Okay, so he's looking at perspective, and there's more than one perspective, and obviously the benefits of time and hindsight. He explores power and the malleability of identity, and so he's broadening the rigid interpretation of identity that occurred as a result of the reception of Plath's poetry. Okay, when we look at the context of Ted Hughes, he is responding to his criticism. Okay, and so certainly he publishes these poems just before he dies, and he doesn't engage in any discussion with anyone about it. He sort of publishes it, you work it out yourself, and that is certainly something that we must factor in. But he's not writing from a modernist perspective, he's writing in a postmodern era. And I've written up at the top here, he does reference, as Plath does, other modernist poets, one of them being T.S. Eliot, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. And in that, the persona is full of indecision and uncertainty, he's unable to act, and he says, I'm Lazarus and I've come back to tell you all, that's not what I meant at all. And so I get the feeling that his poetry is establishing that you've misinterpreted Sylvia Plath's intention, and you've constructed a narrative that suits your agenda that doesn't really it doesn't really reflect what she was what she was attempting to do. So the narrative constructed was scandalous, that she was the victim, and that you know, that there was the victim oppressor binary established, and you know, and that was more important than the actual nuances and the specifics of what was being said. So it's feeding into and it's fueling the agenda of those in power, and certainly I think Hughes is saying it's misinterpreting what she's saying. So the postmodern era, the 1990s and now, is all about reinterpretation. It's about the subjectivity of truth and obviously the ambiguity of it. It's looking at the passing of time and the changing of perspective, or the differences of perspective, and that it is a bit more reflective. And certainly one thing that postmodernists do is they subvert, they use intertextuality, they play around, they blend genres and things like that. So his work certainly is intertextual in the sense that he is appropriating the Sylvia Plath's poetry, but his poetry and her poetry is conversing with other texts, with the Bible, with other modernist poets, with nursery rhymes and fairy tales and things like that build a sense of cultural identity and understanding. And so, just to wrap up, the idea of this module is to look at the discourse that is occurring throughout the ages, driven by this poetry, and it's not contained to the two suites of poetry. It's a means by which we can explore way back into history and looking at the universal experiences of people as they interact with each other. So from here we will go and look at each of the poems. You don't have to know them to the minute detail. You want to be able to pick some ideas and look at the way in which the poems are communicating within each of the texts, but also across the text as well, and that will lead to you being able to build some really interesting body paragraphs and arguments about things like this. That's what we're looking at developing, because that's what gets great marks.